It's lovely to see all of you. One of my favorite things, Tamara and I were reminiscing about how this all started. It was when I got a big grant from NASA a bunch of years ago, and we decided that one of the things we wanted to do was come out here and start a series. And I guess that must have been 6 years ago, something like that. And then we were going every year. I think we did sometimes 2 a year. I was just going strong because you were coming and making us feel welcome. And then the pandemic hit, and well, we all know what happened then. And so what a delight to be back. I'm really appreciative of that. And so since that time, we've gotten a new grant funded. So we ran that one through its course, and now we've been renewed. And so we're going strong for at least another 4 or 5 years with that. And I'm doing a lot of other things. So some of you maybe have heard me speak about the Salton Sea. We're very involved in that as well, trying to figure out what to do with that, right? And Tamara and I and others are scheming on building a research facility here that will speak to the issues of the Salton Sea and try and provide some kind of meaningful bridge to the lithium industry that's being spawned in the southern region of the Salton Sea in ways that help the community by training people to work in the labs that those companies will have, et cetera. So we're really happy about that. And I decided that, that tonight I was going to do something a little bit different, because one of the other things that's happened to me since I last saw all of you is that I was tapped to be a co-leader of what's called a research coordination network. It's sort of the new face of astrobiology, which is what I do at NASA. And this particular research coordination network is focused on the origins of life. And so I, thought it was pretty hard to try and find life elsewhere, and it's a worthy challenge, and I love it every second. But the origins of life, in many ways, is even a more vexing question. And it's even on our own planet. If someone says to you, how did it start? Or if they pretend to know, they're lying to you, because we really don't know. And the disagreements over the fundamental aspects of how it may have begun are huge, really huge. So I walked into this very contentious community of mostly old guys, and it's true, and they could barely talk to each other. And so I, among other people within my group, have been focused on trying to enhance communication and bring along a new generation that's a little bit more open-minded and hasn't invested 30 or 40 years of career into one particular model. And so it's been amazing for me. And so I was thinking of, I don't know why this popped into my head today. I started with a PhD qualifying exam at 8 o'clock, and it's been steady since then. And as I was driving, it popped into my head this idea of, can we talk? I feel like I should sit on the edge and just talk about what I feel and what I'm experiencing. And you'll all remember that was Joan Rivers. Remember that was her catch term, can we talk? So that's what I want to do for you today. I want to convey for you this sort of sense of wonder that I myself feel. Like all of you, you're here, right? And you come to these things often, you're lifelong learners. And so I want to talk about the things that I'm learning. And I'm going to show you some really complex things, not to make you understand the details of them, because the truth is no one does. But I want to show you the things that we're grappling with, the level of understanding that we have, and the point beyond which we're trying to reach. And so you will probably from past talks know of my experience with exoplanets, extrasolar planets. These are planets outside our solar system, and we forgot to mention the 2 coming up, right? So I actually have a slide that does that. You can't really read this, but that was, whoops, there it is. This is just my prompt. On March 23rd, Eddie Sweeterman, who's in our department, is coming and talking about exoplanets. And on April 19th, Stephen Kane, who is also an exoplanet specialist, world-renowned, both of them, he will speak about Venus, but he's going to make a connection between Venus and exoplanets and Earth's past. So they are both true planetary scientists. I'm a geochemist, and we have these complementary interests. And so a lot of my work is focused on using Earth to understand exoplanets and to look for life around exoplanets. And I'll talk a little bit more about that because it is such an exciting time for exoplanets. There we go. Every time I give a talk, I have to update this slide, literally. I gave a talk last week at SWRI, the Southwest Research Institute in Boulder, and the number was 5,272. This was literally last week. And now this week it's 5,300, okay? So just in about 7 days, there are now 28 new exoplanets. There are NASA candidates that are almost 10,000. The truth is, as I was just telling folks a few minutes ago, that probably every star in the universe, and we're focusing on those in the galaxy, probably every star has planets around it. So it's no longer this question of discovering planets. They're coming at us like a fire hose. The question is which ones to look at with things like James Webb and other telescopes to figure out what kind of gases are around them and whether they contain gases that are specific to requiring life. So the biosignatures of exoplanets are the gases in the atmospheres. We're never going to go there. It's not like Perseverance. We're not going to go there like we do to Mars. We're not going to have sample return. We're going to look in ways that I'll show you in a second at spectroscopy data, spectral data of compositions of their atmospheres. And we're going to try to infer from those compositions in the same way that if you looked at Earth, you would see all of our oxygen and say, oh, that's probably from photosynthesis. What a great biosignature. So it's exactly the same thing. Imagine that we're instead turning the telescopes not towards our planet, but away and trying to figure out what those gases mean. And so we have the Transiting Exoplanet Survey satellite that just launched a few years ago, and it is returning data at a rapid clip for these discoveries. And so the best way to discover a planet, believe it or not, is to train a telescope on the ground or in space at a star and watch for periodic dimming of that star. So when a planet passes in front of its star, that's an eclipse, and there is a subtle, it depends on the size of the star and the size of the planet, but there is a subtle to significant, depending on that ratio, dimming of the star. And so you can keep watching and you can see it dim again and again, and you can infer the orbit period of that planet around the star. And in the case of the TRAPPIST system, for example, you can recognize that there are many planets that are going past that star. So the best way, the most common way to identify planets, and the presence is confirmed in other ways, but the initial best way is through that transit method, just watching it dim. And so that's wonderful, but that's just the beginning. Once we have a planet, we'd like to do something with it. And Frank was wisely pointing out, because he knows all of this, is that not only do you get the dimming from that eclipse, but some amount of the starlight passes through that thin veneer of an atmosphere that surrounds the planet. And the gases in that atmosphere interact with the light. And so some of the light comes through and some of the light is absorbed by those gases. And those absorption bands in what we call spectra are fingerprints of gases within that atmosphere. So we can look as the planet is passing in front and we can actually see little dips, little absorption bands that tie fingerprint specific gases in that atmosphere. And so one of the most remarkable things really is a discovery that came from James Webb. We all know that after great delays and cost overruns, Webb launched successfully, and the data that are coming back are remarkable. Galaxies far, far away, the outer edges of the universe, but it is also a telescope that's well designed for finding and characterizing exoplanets. And so just this past summer, there was the first clear evidence for carbon dioxide in a planetary atmosphere outside of our solar system. Remarkable. So these planets are light years away, and we've identified the presence of carbon dioxide. And this comes from what are called transmission spectra, that is the interaction of the light with the gas within the atmosphere. The same thing happens here. It's happening in this room. And so we can characterize that. And so it's not going to be long, I hope, before we discover O2, oxygen, and methane, and other gases that will then prompt NASA, astronomers, astrophysicists, to come to people like us and say, what do those gases mean? Do they possibly mean life? Must they require life? And so those questions will only be answered by people who understand life. And that includes on our own planet, especially on our own planet, as we inform these search engines, if you will, for how to find life elsewhere. And so our Alternative Earths team that has been going now strong for about 7 years is exploring 4 billion years of persistent habitability in a dynamic early Earth to guide NASA's mission-specific search for life on distant planets. So what we do first and foremost as Earth scientists, I worked in the modern ocean for my PhD. We look at rocks all over the world spanning at least 3.5 billion years of history. By looking at those and using various chemical techniques, we can infer ultimately the evolution of our own atmosphere. And we imagine that some distant alien on an exoplanet is looking at us and trying to see if our atmosphere has biosignature gases. And so how would that change over time? Would they see our oxygen today? Probably. Would they see our oxygen maybe 1.5 billion years ago? Maybe not. Would they see methane today? Probably not. Would they have seen methane 2.5 billion years ago? Probably. So we learn so many lessons from our own atmospheric evolution as we think about what to look for in other places. And so Earth has been really many different remarkable worlds. We think of it as the N of one, the one place we know of in the universe with life, but my group tends to think of it as many, many different chapters that are all really fundamentally different planets in many ways. We had times where there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, times where the ocean may have been purple or green, the sky orange, the moon forming impact, which happened within the first few hundreds of millions of years of Earth history, times of very intense bombardment, times of less frequent bombardment, early in our history when molten rock covered the Earth's surface. These all sound like really fantastical places, so different than what we have today, but these are our own planet. Times when the Earth's surface was almost completely covered with ice, maybe 600-700 million years ago. So by studying those different chapters, the rocks deposited during those different times, we can develop an understanding of what a planet can do and why it does that, and what pieces are required to do the most amazing thing of all, that is to retain oceans on a planet like we have for 4.3 billion years. Think about it, for 4.3 billion years, we've had oceans on our surface. We talk about Mars in the past, liquid water there. Venus perhaps had liquid water in its distant past, but we have maintained this habitability, which is so remarkable. If you think, I tell my students that it's like, it's a narrow few tens of degrees centigrade window. It's the temperature between the freezer in your kitchen and the boiling teapot on your stove. Our planet has stayed within that range for over 4 billion years. Even though the sun has been getting dramatically brighter, the Earth's interior has been cooling. And those interactions between the solid and the liquid and the gaseous Earth are what keep us in this sort of natural thermostat way within this habitable zone. It's remarkable. And so the lessons then can be extended to other planets. And so exciting times ahead. The Webb telescope is generating wonderful data. The Nancy Roman telescope, if funding goes well, will launch in the coming years. And the most exciting time ahead are these future exoplanet missions where the telescopes will be optimized for exoplanet characterization. They will have the right range of spectral determination capabilities to look at gases of particular interest for biosignatures. And according to the recent decadal, thankfully, NASA every 10 years asks the National Academy of Science to evaluate them and to make recommendations about what to do. And one of the and it's an independent assessment. NASA puts it into motion and then says, go for it. Tell us what the community wants and why they want that. And so in this new decadal, in this case from astronomy and astrophysics, there's a planetary science one, there are many different decadals. One of the strongest arguments put forth is the need for what's called direct imaging. So direct imaging is where you basically are getting data from the planet itself directly. Now, as I mentioned, the planet passes in front of the star, some amount of light passes through that thin veneer of atmosphere, and you get a subtle signal for a particular gas, but most of the light is coming from the star itself. So there's what we call a signal to noise problem. The signal for the gas in the atmosphere is small compared to all that light from the star. Imagine if you could block out the star, as this artist's vision is indicating. So the way I think about that is, when my kids were small, they'd hear an airplane and I'd say, you see it? And they say, I can't see it, the sun's so bright. What do? You hold your hand up and block the sun, and then you can see the airplane. And that's exactly what this will do. If this kind of system is used, this star shade, as it's called, will fly in tandem with the telescope and literally block the light of the star itself, so that all the light that is detected by the spectrometer will be reflected from the planet through its atmosphere, and you'll get a much stronger signal-to-noise relationship. Super exciting time for exoplanets. So we can ask, are we alone? How does Earth's past guide the search for alien life? But since I've been repositioned in this new group, or additionally positioned, I should say, within this new group at NASA, one of the things that I've gotten really interested in is, so a planet might be habitable now, it might have oceans, it might have liquid water at its surface, maybe it did for a long time, it would be hard to know that, but is it a planet that likely would have generated life early on? And so we start to ask increasingly, How did it all start? How did life start on our planet? And once we understand how life can begin, can we imagine using that information to imagine other planetary systems where life could have also begun? And now we're just getting that one snapshot of today that could represent, as it does on our planet, billions of years of evolution of life, culminating in where we are now. But it will continue to evolve, right? Our atmosphere will continue to evolve. As our star gets bright, CO2 will drop ultimately. Many things will change over time. So how did it all start? So what I want to do for you in this sense of my voyage of discovery is talk to you about sort of the wonder of biology and biochemistry, the things that people are doing, the community of workers that for decades and decades have been trying to resolve one of the great questions. How did life start? In my mind, there are three big questions. You probably have your own views on this. One is a religious question. Is there a God? And what happens after we die? Those are connected. And I'll let you sort those things out for yourself. The other is, are we alone? Is there life in the universe? If there are planets around every star, there's a pretty good chance, but that doesn't mean anything when you think about how remarkable our Earth is. Is there another planet like ours? Maybe, maybe not. And then the question is, how did it start? And so that really gets me up in the morning these days. And so I'm learning so much new. This group that I'm with are completely different. I didn't know any of them before I started getting involved with them. And every day I learn from them. And every day I try and take my understanding of the physical and chemical evolution of our planet and how that informs how life could have begun beyond just the biochemistry that they're doing. Most of them are not geologists. They're not astrobiologists. They mostly focus on biochemical reactions that are incredibly complex and incredibly elegant. So I find all of this, like, in a way, sort of poetic. It's just amazing. So oxygen-producing photosynthesis, arguably the most important reaction that has ever occurred on Earth, right? It does so many things. It produces life in the ocean. So these are organisms like algae that live in the ocean, and they use light like plants, and they produce their biomass, their bodies, and those organisms live and they die, and things feed on them. And so those primary producers that have the ability to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, as it shows there, and convert it to sugars and ultimately to life, those things are what puts everything into motion, because something eats them, and then something eats that, and something eats that, and that's the food web or the trophic structure that we talk about. It has to begin with something. You have to have something that can get something from nothing, this ability to take CO2 and produce a plant. What a remarkable reaction. But at the same time, it also produces O2. And oxygen first accumulated in our atmosphere about 2.3 billion years ago because of this reaction. We went from a world where you and I could never have lived. We wouldn't have recognized it. There were bacteria that were adapted to living without oxygen. But at 2.3 billion years ago, everything changed. There were now portions of the ocean and the Earth's surface where organisms like us that respire, that require oxygen, that very energetic process, could evolve. It was a fundamental transition, culminating at about 600 to 700 million years ago with the first animals, and then progressively moving towards us. So we are products of that reaction. The other thing is that carbon dioxide is used. So carbon dioxide is the carbon that's fixed, and it comes out as the sugar, the glucose. And so the amount of photosynthesis, the amount of burial of the biological material, that controls the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that controls climate. So there's a first-order climate control to all of this because CO2, as we all know, is such an important greenhouse gas. So what an important reaction. And I said to myself, what do I really know about it? Well, it turns out not very much. And so I just want to take you through a little bit of my own voyage of discovery. Just be amazed, not by me, but by the elegance of what people have figured out over the past 100 years or so. And it really is about a 100-year journey of the specifics of the chemistry. So photosynthesis, as we all know, but because it's photosynthesis, has a strong light dependency, but that's only part of it. There's also something called the Calvin cycle that happens in the dark. It doesn't require light at all. And so you look at that and think, oh my God, how does that ever evolve? And does that evolve somewhere else? What is the likelihood that this will come together in another place and give us an atmosphere that has oxygen? Tim just said that oxygen could be a great biosignature around another planet. Is this likely ever to happen somewhere else? Well, keep your wonder caps on, because this is just the tip of it. And so to give you a little bit of a history of how this all emerged, back in the 1700s, Joseph Priestley, who some of you will have heard of before, Priestley realized that, and I know you can't read this is just to prompt me, he realized back in 1771 that plants can purify air that had burned the candle out. So he put a candle in a bell jar, and the oxygen was consumed, and the candle went out because there was a lack of oxygen. If you put a plant in it, through photosynthesis, it generated something he didn't really know, although he discovered oxygen, so he probably suspected it might be that. But suddenly the candle could burn again. And so that was the extent of it, right? He didn't know anything about the reactions. And then in 1779, a Netherlands, a Dutch scientist, looked at Priestley's experiments and saw that there was a light dependence. So this is in the 1700s, that there's something that makes it so combustion can occur. We now know that's oxygen. And for that to happen, there has to be light. That's photosynthesis, but that was in the 1700s. Fast forward to 1915, and a German who won the Nobel Prize suggested that chlorophyll, we all know about chlorophyll, that's central to photosynthesis, was probably playing a major role. And there are other discoveries. In 1940, there was another Nobel Prize for someone who was investigating the nature, the specific properties of chlorophyll. In 1954, Kelvin, for whom the Kelvin cycle is named, discovered that reaction that involves carbon, specifically the incorporation of CO2, et cetera. And then as late as 1984, the Nobel Prize for this was actually in 1988 for this work, who look at the structure of photosynthetic reactions centered within bacteria. So four Nobel Prizes were focused on this specific question. And so this is what the light-centered portion of it looks like. Again, this is just so you'll go, wow, are we gonna find that somewhere else? So there's photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. They're products of these reactions. Some of you will have heard of ATP and this NADPH. Again, I'm learning, lifetime learner. I often say to my students, because at this point I've done enough that I have to be too embarrassed. I held it as a secret for a long time. I haven't had a biology class since 9th grade. I studied engineering. In college, and there was no biology. So I have had to teach myself a lot. And so this is the photoactive part. You can see light coming in here and light coming in there. But that's not all of it. It's much more complicated than that. And so there are these pieces of the light dependence. And so this is the first thing that I really want you to see, where oxygen is produced. That's where the oxygen comes from. That's in that first part of the cycle, before it gets to the Kelvin part. This is where light is involved, and water is split, yielding O2 and hydrogen. Now, this P680 and P700, these are both chlorophyll-containing centers. And this is what they look like. Incredible. So there's the P680 with the two chlorophylls, the PD1 and the PD2, and here's the P700 with the green of the chlorophyll. Right, amazing. And then here's the Kelvin cycle that happens in the dark. So it's fed the ATP from that light-dependent portion of the cycle, and the NADPH comes over here. And so at this point, what's happening is the CO2, this is not as hard as it looks, I suppose. The CO2 is coming in, and there's the Rubisco enzyme that probably you've heard of, right? So the Rubisco enzyme is driving this cycle, and all the way down here at the bottom, here's the sugar. There's the glucose. Okay. Crazy. And that's simplified. So I have friends who've been working their entire careers on how photosynthesis works and how it started. And could it have started somewhere else? I was telling a friend about this, and she said that at her university, there were 8 different groups working on the origins and evolution of photosynthesis, and they didn't talk to each other. And it's even more complicated because different plants have different relationships to the Kelvin cycle that actually have to do with climate and the evolution of climate, whether it's warm or cold, whether it's wet or dry. And so the plants have adapted to have special layers that help them deal with certain climates versus others. So that's the 5-cent version of $1 million system that is oxygen producing photosynthesis. So, we're looking at that and we're thinking, well, how does that happen? I mean, really, let's be honest, Tim, how does that happen? And my answer would be, it's chemistry, man and woman, that's what it is. And it's 4.5 billion years of Earth history that allow these things to come together. And perhaps they'll come together in the same way on another planet. But as we look historically at essentially every civilization, going back as far as you care to look, they weren't trying to explain photosynthesis, but they were trying to explain where they came from and where the things surrounding them came from. And so every culture that I've explored has some kind of creation, spiritual story. The Native Americans in North America have as many different hundreds of them, including the Turtle Island story that some of you will have heard of. And so in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, all these different stories emerged. And it was all after this same basic question. It's not like they were talking to each other. They were separated by oceans and hundreds and even thousands of years. They were all asking that question like, why the hell are we here? Where did we come from? And so, cue the music. It's perfect timing. And so, some people can be happy, can be perfectly happy, and I don't judge, saying that this is sort of beyond the imagination of how this kind of sequence of reactions, and that's just one thing. That was just oxygenic photosynthesis. The world is full of so many analogous things that are similarly complex and interact. And so you can say, I just can't wrap my brain around that, and so I'm going to give somebody else credit. But that's not what we do, at least in this seminar series. If we met on Sunday, we might do it. But tonight, what we're going to talk about is the science of all of this, and just give you a sense of wonder for what we do and still don't know about the beginnings of all these things. And so Darwin really put a lot of this into motion. In 1859, he published The Origin of Species. He took about 20 years before he published it from when he first had the idea. He wanted to make sure he was right? So he traveled the world on the Beagle. He put together a huge database, many different arguments, and in many respects, he had it right. It's an extraordinary publication. It's one of the most important publications in history. But what Darwin didn't understand, really, and he was using animals, living animals, and he understood fossil animals, macroscopic creatures. What he didn't really understand was this, the trunk of the tree. Where did that all come from? It created a thing I'll make a brief allusion to at the end called Darwin's dilemma, Because this record of animals that he was looking at was about 500 million years. Now, I know that's a long time, but the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. So how did these things spring up out of, quote unquote, nothing? How did that happen? He just didn't know. And so I found this out just yesterday. It was so interesting. This is the only known speculation by Darwin on the origin of life. This part. He had a lot of ideas about that, but this part. And so you'll recognize this because it talks about his warm little pond. But if, and oh, what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc., present that a protein compound, I don't know, this was in 1871, a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. He said that in 1871, and so that gave rise to this first notion of a special spot, a warm little pond, and we're still there in many respects, as you'll see, a special spot where life could have begun from nothing biological to something that is the rest of this tree. And so my interests are not that tree of animals, although we care about that some in other research. My interests increasingly now are on those first hundreds of millions of years of Earth history, when things began that we would call biological from a world that was completely without life. And so as Darwin recognized, if you remember that quote, towards complexity, what Darwin recognized, and we focus on so much now, is this idea of taking a place that might be habitable. Now that doesn't mean there's life, doesn't mean it's inhabited, it just means there could be life. And the currency for looking for the possibility of life is liquid water. So remember in the Watergate days, it was follow the money. The search for life beyond our planet or in our solar system in the past, or the watery worlds of Enceladus and Europa, or in distant planets far beyond our solar system, the centerpiece of the initial step is looking for places that either have or had liquid water, had oceans. Water is essential to life for so many reasons. It's the universal solvent. It allows for transfer of materials across cell membranes. It does so many things. Because of its charge properties, it's really ideal. And so it starts with that, but then it just begins. If we allow, as you'll see in a second, that the early Earth had oceans, maybe 4.3 billion years ago, then we have to start from a prebiotic world. There's no life. We have to imagine chemical reactions that give us the building blocks of life until these simple molecules become more complex molecules that are called polymers. And so there's a lot of research on that. And the involvement of these things called vesicles that could have been precursors to, let me turn this on, sorry. Precursors to cells with a membrane, with material migrating in and material migrating out. And then you see these ellipses, the 3 dots, and it's like, okay, I've got maybe a protein. Maybe I have an amino acid. How do I get to this, which is the tree of life as we know it? And this is where we know the least, I have to say. We just really have no idea when or how this happened. We don't really know how metabolism's evolved. Most of the focus now is on this and that. And there's an awful lot of low-hanging fruit to be picked in the in-between. Now we're talking about with those ellipses maybe 4 billion years ago, something like that. So we know where the elements came from. Carl Sagan famously put that the nitrogen in our DNA and the calcium in our teeth and the iron in our blood and the carbon in our apple pies were made in the interiors of collapsing stars. We are made of star stuff. How many of you heard that quote? It's pretty famous, right? So we know that stars produce elements, and different stars produce different kinds of elements, and a main sequence star can get up at least to iron, and there are ways of getting heavier elements. And that's just the beginning, right? It's just like, okay, we know why there are more elements. We know why there's more than hydrogen. We know how these things can distribute throughout a solar system, a planetary system as it's first developing throughout the universe. But how does it become something more? Well, a turning point for me, and I was 18 years old, I was an undergraduate, and I took a class that met at 8 in the morning. And that's tough when you're in college, you know. And I was living in Colorado at the time, and we would go from the snow into this warm room, and they would turn the lights out. And they would, for the first hour of 2 hours, they would show a movie. Do any of you know The Ascent of Man by Jay Bernowski? Have you heard of that book at all? It's really terrific. I mean, it was a long time ago, but it was, at that time, I really enjoyed the different chapters. He was really a Renaissance thinker. And then one of the chapters was on the famous Miller-Urey experiment, which happened in the 1950s with Stanley Miller, graduate student, and Harold Urey at the University of Chicago. Harold Urey and Stanley were the brains behind this. Urey won a Nobel Prize when he was around 40, late 30s, something like that, and not for this, for something else, for work on isotope systems. So Urey was a smart guy, and what he did is take the idea of Darwin's little pond. So he took an atmosphere as he envisioned it with ammonia and methane and carbon dioxide, and he simulated the idea of an electrical discharge that might come from lightning. In this case, he used a sparker. And when they came back the next day after running this system, they found with just those gases, water vapor in there as well, when they came back the next day, these bells were lined with brown gook. And the gook was amino acids, right? So they created amino acids in this purely abiotic, they made sure the glass was clean, in this purely abiotic system. And I can remember when I was 18 sitting there and thinking, oh, wow, okay. Now it's a long way from amino acids to us. And you can find amino acids on meteorites. We know that they come in that way and they're formed in space through non-biological processes. But that was really a moment for me, and maybe a defining moment, really. Maybe that's when I first, whether I knew it or not, became an astrobiologist. To imagine that a pretty simple experiment like this could give you a building block of life. And so as we think about our planet, as I've said, we can go back 4.5 billion years ago. That's about the time that we were hit by something the size of Mars. And the material that was spawned off became our moon. And so here's an early image that would have been like soon after that. The impact of that large object melted everything at the surface. We had magma oceans. The moon was really big because it was really close. It was the same size, but it was really close. And over time, it's moved away just because of the centrifugal force as it's been orbiting our planet. So that's what the world may have looked like. And you know, for many, many years, people imagined that the first 500 million years of Earth was like this. In fact, it's called the Hadean, after Hades, the god of the underworld. So 500 million years of something that apparently spawned life, but how could it if it looked like that? Well, the answer is that it probably didn't look like that. The answer is that going back as far as 3.3, maybe 4.3, maybe 4.4 billion years ago, we have evidence for oceans. And that evidence comes in very strange ways. And it's way beyond the time we have to explain this in detail. But some very clever scientists, including people based at UCLA, not far away, Mark Harrison, he's listening right now. He discovered, and other people discovered, that you could collect these little grains from an area of northwestern Australia called the Pilbara Craton. And these are sand grains of a mineral called zircon. And you can look at the composition of those grains, and you can look at the isotopes within that composition, and you can make pretty convincing arguments, and nobody really challenges this anymore, that not only did the Earth have liquid water 4.3, 4.4 billion years ago, but maybe a lot of it. So these grades not only provide that evidence, but they can be dated by something called the uranium-lead system. So through a radioactive decay, you can date these and see evidence in the isotopes for liquid water. Amazing. So it's so different. It's not this world, but it's something much more like today, a world with water. And so that's sort of the starting point as we think about the history of life on our planet. Now, if we move forward from that, we have to think, well, why is there water? Well, why would that be a question? It's because our sun has been getting brighter over time. If we go back 4.5 billion years ago, this is the beginning of our solar system, the sun, as this indicates, was only 70% as bright as it is today. And the sun, we know this from main sequence stars. We're a G-type star. This is what stars do. There's no magic here. This is just known. We can look at stars all through the galaxy and see them in different stages of this maturation. And so the star was only 70% as bright as it is today, our sun, yet we had liquid water. How can that be? Why wasn't the planet in a deep freeze? Well, the answer is greenhouse gases. So I always say to my students, today we dread the greenhouse gas, right? We dread all the CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere. But were it not for natural levels of greenhouse gases through time, in particular CO2 and methane, we wouldn't be here to worry about what's happening now at human hands. And so the greenhouse gases and how they've changed through time is a big part of the story, because they keep the Earth habitable, they keep the liquid oceans, and in many cases, in the case of methane in particular, those gases are also biosignatures. They're also derived from life. And so we can imagine an early world that might have looked like this, where the atmosphere had CO2 plus or minus methane, and so you can build up methane levels where you start to get more complex organic molecules from the photochemistry, from the sun interacting with the gases, the methane in particular. And so the sky is thought to have been orange, like Titan today. And the ocean, because there was no oxygen, may have had iron in a state that was green rather than red. So we may have had green oceans and orange skies. And so people have been speculating on what that earliest atmosphere was like. Could it have been that atmosphere that Miller and Urey used in their experiment? Was it what we say reducing? Did it have all that ammonia and methane, reduced compounds that if spark could produce those amino acids? And the general thinking was that probably not. And it has to do with the timing that the core formed and things that are way beyond what we want to talk about now. But we moved away from this understanding of the Miller-Urey world, and it created some of a dilemma. Like, well, okay, that's probably not right, but how do we play with that? Well, one way that we play with that is that we imagine that impacts, large asteroids, planetesimals, large features hitting the Earth's surface can change our atmosphere. And so this is a paper that came out not very many years ago, 2020, that imagined that a large impact, not huge, but a large impact, not a moon-forming impact, but something quite large, it could bring the right kind of chemical constituents so that you would get an atmosphere like the one that Miller and Urey envisioned, reducing enough, methane enough, and other compounds like hydrogen cyanide, things that are essential as building blocks for life. So just maybe through impacts, we generated an atmosphere that was consistent with our needs, per the Miller-Urey experiment. And so impacts have become increasingly important. How objects have hit our Earth, how frequently they've hit our Earth, and they can change the composition of the atmosphere, which can lead to reactions that can give us the simple building blocks that become more complex molecules that ultimately become life. The other thing that these impacts can do is they can bring organic molecules. So it's famously known that meteorites, chondrites, for example, have lots of organic compounds. Now, nobody thinks those are related to life, but they represent these kinds of formative processes that can occur in the absence of life that can give you things like amino acids and the other simple, relatively simple molecules that become the building blocks of life. And that's how this story goes as we try and think about the evolution of life on our planet. We know early in our history that we had many large impacts. So if they played a role in delivering organic compounds as building blocks of life, or if they played a role in changing the atmosphere so those compounds could form within that atmosphere, they certainly could have done it then, because there were so many and so big. Another really popular idea is that life began, and this is so fundamentally different from some of the other ideas that I'll talk about, that life began on the deep sea floor, in these deep sea vents. So some of you have heard this theory, right? The idea of high temperature fluids coming up on the sea floor. You've heard of black smokers. And so some of these vents that are coming up on the sea floor are associated with very alkaline waters. So some of you probably drink alkaline water, right? You get it delivered or you go to the store and you've been told that drinking alkaline water is good for you. I'm not here to speak to that. I'm not an expert on that. But what I will tell you is that these systems, some of them on the seafloor, produce waters that have very high pHs, that have high alkalinities. And what people have discovered, really smart people have discovered, is that these systems are perfect places for what's called a proton motive force. And so you have these high pH alkaline waters coming out in the vent, and the seawater itself has a lower pH, and that creates a gradient. And that's really important. Life is about gradients, moving protons, moving electrons. Movement of electron is like the currency of life, right? That's such a big part of it. And so in these systems, you can move protons from the place where there are more to less as related to the pH differences. And that thing is called, believe it or not, the proton motive force. And this is really important in life. This proton motive force in living organisms today, that flow of protons from a place where there are more than less, and proton is just what you're measuring with pH, right? If you have a lot of protons, that's an acidic system. And so this flow of protons from where there's a lot to less is thought to drive, in a mechanical energy sense, leading ultimately to a chemical reaction, the incorporation of phosphorus from ADP to ATP. Now, you may not know what ATP is, but you should. It's adenosine triphosphate. It's an organic compound that provides energy that drives many processes in living cells. So ATP is an energy source. It's a really important energy source. And so this process of proton motive force may lead to the formation of ATP. That's going to become really important in some of the final slides. ATP is an important energy molecule found in all life forms. Specifically, it is a coenzyme that works with enzymes such as ATP, triphosphatase, to transfer energy to cells by releasing its phosphate group. Taking a simple system, a vent on a seafloor, imagining the proton motive force and how that could lead to this incorporation of phosphorus that gives you this ATP. So this is what life is doing, but what they were saying was, would this be a perfect place? Maybe this would be a perfect place to create those kinds of compounds. This vent coming into the ocean is giving you that same gradient that we have in cells that could allow for this very difficult reaction of the incorporation of phosphorus from ADP to ATP. Ninth grade since biology. I'm doing my best. And so these systems also are remarkable in that they contain wonderful minerals. And there's been a popular idea for years and years and years that minerals may template these simple molecules, a electrochemical reaction between the crystal itself and these dissolved organic molecules, and give us a way of organizing those organic molecules into increasingly complex things that could become bigger and bigger building blocks of life. So clay minerals are important, and in those hydrothermal systems, Pyrite is a really important mineral that may play a role in all of this. And so the final thing that I want to talk about is this thing that has really dominated the study of the origins of life for the past couple of decades. It's the idea of an RNA world. Have some of you have heard of this? Yes? No? So in the group that I'm part of now within NASA, my co-leads are decidedly not RNA world members. And so they don't even go to the same meetings as the RNA world people. And the hydrothermal vent community goes to their own meetings. And that's the state of affairs. So that's why we haven't figured it out yet, right? Because we have all these really polarized communities, and they're old guys who yell at each other. And so here's a really strange thing that's happened through all of this. This very nice man, Sid Altman, put all of this into motion. So I was a graduate student at Yale, and I was going up the elevator with my advisor, who is a pretty prominent guy, and we're riding up the elevator. Do any of you know the New Haven campus? There's the Klein Biology Tower by the Peabody Museum. It's a big, tall. It's a architecturally significant building, allegedly, but it's pretty ugly. But we're riding up the elevator to have lunch on the top floor, and the door opens, and this guy walks in. And I didn't know anything about what was going on. And my advisor, Bob Berner, looks and says, "Hey, Sid, congrats." I get chills thinking about this. And we got off and I said, "What was that all about?" He said, "Oh, well, Sid just won the Nobel Prize." It's like, Jesus, that's pretty cool. So he won it in, young scientists like, wow. So in 1989, he won the Nobel Prize. And he did it for something that was really remarkable. And he never could have imagined that this would spawn the whole RNA world that has set back origins of life studies by maybe many years. And so what he realized is that the catalytic forces that are required in life to make reactions occur, we tend to think of that as all occurring within proteins, right? So proteins are so important. We have proteins. These are the building blocks of enzymes they're the business end, right? That make all this stuff happen. That's why we're warm, because these enzymes are metabolizing and making things happen within our bodies. And so there was long this dilemma within the origins of life community. It was called the chicken and egg conundrum. We use that term in many ways, but it's been applied in this case. That proteins require DNA to store information. So for a protein to assemble, it needs the genetic information that's encoded within DNA. So you've got energy, metabolism, but you also have information that's required. The DNA is harboring the information that basically translates how the protein is formed. But the problem is that the protein, or the protein needs the DNA to know how to form, but the DNA needs the protein because it's the source of energy. Does that make sense? DNA tells protein how to form. DNA needs protein to keep alive, to keep functioning. So which came first? They need each other. And so what Altman's work told us is that maybe it wasn't a protein at all, maybe it was RNA. Because what he realized is that, and it had never been discovered before, that RNA, in addition to carrying information, had the ability to catalyze reactions. It could function like a protein. And I read about the experiment, and it was pretty simple, right? And it's like, usually the best things are simple, right? Because they carry the biggest implications. And so he discovered the catalytic properties of RNA. So now you didn't need to figure out whether the protein or the DNA came first, DNA carrying the information to form a protein required to sustain the DNA. Let's just let RNA do all of that, because RNA can carry information and it can catalyze reactions. And so that has led to things like this. Like, oh my God, right? Right, this is one of those guys. He's the worst of them. Don't tell him I said that, please. But oh my goodness, he is absolutely obsessed with the RNA world. And there are so many bits of information, but I love learning this, right? I'm just learning this stuff. And so it's not, if I pull it apart, unpack it for you a little bit, I think you'll know that nucleotides are the building blocks of RNA and DNA, right? So and so what we're trying to do in a non-biological way, no life, just through chemical abiotic reactions, come up with nucleotides so that we could build RNA and do what Altman told us RNA could do. And so there's a lot of stuff here, and I really wanted to show it to you so that you would see that there's a lot of stuff. But to unpack it, Here are the nitrogenous bases. So if you've had any biology, you know that a nucleotide has a nitrogenous, nitrogen-containing base. You'll recognize some of these names, uracil and adenine and guanine. Distant memory, sometime in biology you had those. And so what happens is that these have to go through additions. These nitrogen-containing bases have to go through additions. The first is the addition of a sugar, either ribose or deoxyribose, whether it's RNA or DNA, right? So there has to be a sugar molecule that's glommed onto these bases. And here's the hardest thing of all. You have to add phosphorus to it. It's called phosphorylation. So one of the biggest building blocks, or roadblocks, I should say, in understanding how life began is understanding how this phosphorus could have been glommed on. That's a whole dissertation, one reaction. Somebody did in a lab, based on theory, predicted it with theory, and then ran it in the lab to understand how phosphorus could be added to the nitrogen-containing base that also has a sugar attached to it. And once you do those three things, have those three things together, then you have the base, you have the nucleotide that can give you RNA. And so there has been massive amounts of work. I just heard of a new center that's based at 4 universities, I think Cambridge and Chicago, a few others, that just got $100 million to focus on RNA world questions. And it may not be right at all, right? Maybe it was on Vents, or maybe it was somewhere else. But it still drives a lot of the research. And this is one of Benner's recent papers that shows it's like, you know, the perfect day on Earth, right? It's where everything comes together, where you have an impact that gives you the reducing atmosphere like I talked about. You can get the nitrogen compounds like hydrogen cyanide that become those nucleobases. And then you can add phosphorus, especially if a certain mineral is involved, so says Steve Benner. And at the end of the day, you might end up with RNA that goes into the ocean. Now think about that. That's a big deal, right? That's important genetic information. But going from RNA to life, to a metabolism, to us, is still so many steps. But that's where the focus is right now, right? Just trying to get from simple molecules to more complex molecules and envisioning ultimately how those come together. Now, in the final piece, what I want to talk about is that another really important part of this equation is that there are needs for land areas. And that's really an elegant idea. And this is the group that I work with most closely. They're really focused on this. Now, this information can be distilled down to something very simple. Those little blue dots are amino acids, okay? And what you ultimately want to do is assemble those amino acid dots into a chain, which is a protein, okay? It's really hard for that to happen. And what they've demonstrated through experimental work is that if you throw the amino acids in with hydroxy acids, and then here's the important thing, take it through wet-dry cycles. Let it become wet and then dry and wet and then dry, that this polymerization reaction occurs where you get longer and longer molecules and you end up with a protein, okay? So the wet-dry cycles are really important to a lot of people. Well, that's all well and good, but the early Earth may not have had any places that were dry, right? So we know from, this is where I come in as a geologist, we know that plate tectonics, that you all know so well since we live here next to the San Andreas Fault, plays an incredibly important role in controlling the formation of continents and how high the continents are, the interactions of the continents moving around through time. Modern style plate tectonics probably didn't come into play until about 3 billion years ago, right? So long after this. So we're left with a time in Earth history when life was beginning where we may not have had land areas to do the wet-dry cycles. You have to have something that's above the ocean, that can be dry, at least episodically. And maybe the tide comes in and it gets wet, and then it's dry. It's wet, or maybe there's a flood event, maybe it's rainy like now, and then it's dry, which is more typical here. So how do we get wet-dry cycles? One idea is that, like the Hawaiian Islands, plumes come from deep within the ocean and create little islands. That could have been the places where life began. And an idea that I like comes back to this importance of impacts. We call it the impacts of impacts. That when these struck the Earth's surface, craters that formed, the rims may have been above sea level and could have given us the dry areas. So this is something we did with an artist recently. That's an impact over there. It's high and dry, could give us wet-dry cycles. Maybe nascent plate tectonics could have given us things like the Aleutians, island chains where you could have done it. But this is the state of the art, right? It's trying to understand how important are these land areas. And so why would that be important? Well, because as we're looking for life in other places, and Europa, which is a moon around Jupiter, and Enceladus, which is a moon around Saturn, they both have massive amounts of liquid water beneath an icy cap. These are really attractive targets for the search for life, living life within our own solar system. And so, well, okay, let's think about that. They don't have land. They have icy surfaces. Almost a priori, you have to depend on the hydrothermal vents on the floor. And we know that there are hydrothermal vents, especially with Enceladus, because we can see hydrogen in the plumes that are coming out. And I'll show you, there's an image right there. We can fly through those plumes and characterize what's in the ocean. And we see hydrogen that can be formed on the seafloor, which can give building blocks of life and can support life in a metabolic way. So these are, again, really attractive. They have more liquid water, these two moons, the Earth, each of them. And they're way beyond our habitable zone, way, way, way. So they're too far from the sun. They shouldn't have liquid water. The reason they do is because of tidal interactions. So Jupiter and Saturn are huge, the moons are small. And as the moon goes around the planet, it contracts and expands as it goes through, and that generates frictional heat that gives these massive amounts of liquid water. So in the coming days and years, you're going to be hearing about the Europa Clipper, which is going to fly around Europa. It's a complex flyby scenario, but it'll go past Europa multiple times, and it will characterize the surface of Europa, looking for compounds that might be related to these processes. And from the new decadal, one of the new decadals, there is a plan for a mission to Enceladus, which really, really excites me, because Enceladus looks like this. This is the south pole of Enceladus. These are cracks in the ice where ocean water is coming up. And so we have already flown past these and identified organic compounds, not necessarily biological. Remember, there are a lot of organic compounds that are building blocks of life. They're on meteorites. They're not life yet. But we see those organic compounds, potential building blocks, and we see hydrogen, that all-important hydrogen that can lead to so many things, including supporting life. So this is artist enhanced, but this is a real image. And in the coming 10 to 20 years, we'll get data from these. And so the question is, as we think about exoplanets, what can a water world do? There's a likely chance that a large percentage of the liquid water containing planets that we discover won't have continents. So should we even bother to look at them if you need wet-dry cycles and you need emergent land? Should we just focus on those that through rotation and the signals that we get indicate that there are land masses? That's why I argue that it's so important to understand some of the basic constraints, building blocks of life as we choose targets. Not only do we want the planet to be able to support life, we want it in its ancient history to have been able to generate life. And to do that, we have to understand how it happens on our own planet. And so I'll end with a famous quote from Carl Zimmer. Many of you will know him as a science writer, one of the best, I think, really. And as he was speaking on the origins of life, and you saw my figure with all the stuff, he said it's a Jackson Pollock, a biochemical Jackson Pollock, a field of strings and tangles and loops. Certainly Steve Benner has given us a Jackson Pollock. And it's really elegant. I'm being facetious. It's really elegant. It's just whether it's right, because it requires so many pieces to have come together. To me, really, it is a combination of understanding chemistry and physics and being creative and open-minded research, not locking into one model, which ends up happening. It's really hard as a scientist after 40 years of being one to say, I think I've been wrong for 40 years. And in my last 5 years, I'm going to do something different. It usually doesn't happen that way. There's too much inertia. And so that's kind of part of what we're fighting with this origins of life work. And so an understanding of early Earth, because you don't just have to think about the reactions, you have to know what the planet was doing. You have to know if there was water. You have to know if the pH was right in the ocean. You can let certain compounds be present versus not. Were there wet-dry cycles? Were there continents? And so that's why, maybe for the first time in a systematic way, geologists are working with prebiotic chemists to understand those relationships. And you need patience in a very old planet. So one of the things that we now have is a solution to Darwin's dilemma. Remember, Darwin speculated on the origins of life in those warm little ponds, but I didn't realize it. He didn't even publish on that. It was just in a letter. That's what happens when you leave your letters lying around. And so we know that he was thinking about this. But it drove him kind of crazy to imagine why. He didn't know it was 500 million years ago, but he knew it was a long time ago. He knew that Earth had a long history, and he could see rocks where there was like nothing, 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 and then suddenly what we call the Cambrian explosion. There was lots of animal life. And he thought, where did that come from if there was nothing before? Well, the research of my group and many other groups have demonstrated that we can start to understand how life began, and we can see evidence for life, isotopic evidence, even fossil evidence that goes back nearly 3.7 billion years ago. So we have evidence that goes back 3.7 billion years ago for a process like photosynthesis. So we know that, and we know that somehow it began before that, and then we know that once it was there, the oceans and life just persisted and evolved and evolved and evolved, as this figure indicates. And so we can all be very frustrated about how much there is still to do, but I get very excited, especially as I think about wanting to get funding for continued research. Like, damn, we figured it all out. There's nothing left to do. That's never going to happen, right? And so Neil deGrasse Tyson, as you've seen already, he said the universe is under no obligation to make sense to you. So if this is like a mess, you're welcome, right? And so that's what it is. And Richard Dawkins, who is a card-carrying hardcore atheist, if you've read any of Richard Dawkins, he said the universe does not owe us meaning, right? And so I'm fine with that, right? I make this distinction between what can never be known, which is faith-based, versus the things that I don't know. And there are a lot of things I don't know. There are a lot of things that none of us know. And so what I think, and this is my quote, what we can expect is the opportunity to use our minds to address the great remaining complexities in science, things that are knowable. Like, how can we know? The origins of life, just because I don't know doesn't mean we won't know. Think how far we've come, RNA dogma aside, how far we've come over just decades. Things already known, and the best of all, so many things that are left to be discovered. And NASA has done and Frank and I were talking about this, NASA in its astrobiology investments has done so much to bring, if life, and one of the 5 main rungs on the ladder of NASA science is looking for life beyond our planet. And if we're going to do that, we have to understand all of these things as we think about the tools to develop, the telescopes to design, the missions to design, to find evidence for that life elsewhere. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to pass out the quizzes now. Are you all ready for that?
Phosphorylation, yes, no.
We'll take a few questions for Dr. Lyons. If you have a question, just raise your hand. I'm going to start up front here with you, sir.
I feel like I know all of you, but I don't know your names. Remind me, we've met before many times.
Don Beggs.
Nice to see you again.
It's nice to be back after 3 years.
Yeah, we're still here.
Yes. Your talk is predicated upon the habitable concept of what you need. Is it conceivable that life could begin any other way?
Sure.
Or have not all those features in some galaxy somewhere or other?
It's a great question. People always ask, like, you know, you're basing a lot of this, predicating a lot of this on life as we know it, right? And so you have to start somewhere, right? And our own life, we still don't know very well. And that's a semi-satisfying explanation. But what I say that's more satisfying is that life as we know it on Earth has basic requirements, right? It has to reproduce. That's a really important part of Darwinian evolution, for example. That's what survival of the fittest is, that you're doing well, you're adapting to an environment so that you reproduce and spread your genes. So it has to reproduce. It has to have an energy source, right? Whether it's light or through heterotrophy, eating something. Those things are going to be true everywhere. They have to have basic building blocks. And so people ask me about silicon life forms. It's possible, but there's a reason that carbon is the dominant element in life on Earth. It forms strong bonds, it makes large molecules. Carbon is the best element to use for life, and it probably will be elsewhere. And it's incredibly abundant in the universe, right? So it's really well suited to life, and there's a lot of it. So, yes, those things we can look for. So as we think about exoplanets, nutrients are always going to be important, phosphorus and nitrogen. How do you cycle phosphorus on a water world? That's a really good question, right? A planet that doesn't have plate tectonics. We know what's required to do that on our own planet. can we understand on another planet whether it's doing the same thing or something different? There are basic physical properties of, nitrogen can be fixed out of the atmosphere. We have 80% N2 in our atmosphere. And life actually takes that, not all life, certain life, this is why we rotate crops, for example. Certain life can take N2 and make it into ammonia or nitrate, which then is fed to everybody else who can't do that. And so is there nitrogen in that atmosphere? Phosphorus on Earth doesn't do that. We don't have phosphorus in the atmosphere. So phosphorus comes from rocks, and it's just recycled over and over and over and over. And the best way to do that is through plate tectonics. Let the phosphorus deposit on the seafloor as dead life, and then let the continents collide and bring it back up and let it be cycled again. So many of our elements are cycled over and over and over. And I asked the question of, must a planet that we're looking at have plate tectonics? Is that basic fact required for life elsewhere? So it's a great question, and the way I think about it is that there are some universals, I think for sure, like carbon, I would say. But the way I envision this is that by looking at all of this stuff that Earth has told us, it's like a bunch of Legos, right? You have to get phosphorus somehow, you have to get nitrogen, and they've assembled in Earth in a particular way, and that's changed through time as plate tectonics came on and continents weren't there, and then they were there. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere, and then there was a lot. And so those blocks are doing their things. But those blocks are universals in many respects. And so what I imagine, and you can do this with numerical models, you can create any world you want. And so you can take those blocks and assemble them in different ways and imagine how they might give you something analogous, if not the same as Earth, on some distant world. And so, great question. Who knows exactly, but we start somewhere and we try to keep it as simple as possible to the things that would be most expected elsewhere. Yes?
I would like to know if you think that our planet is being terraformed. I didn't hear a real answer to are we alone, but
is it being terraformed by some other planet? I don't think so. No. I mean, as I look at the evolution, the thing I didn't mention that my research group spends a lot of time thinking about the antiquity of oxygenic photosynthesis. It's actually a really, really hard question to answer. Like, when did that start on Earth? It's really hard to answer. So when things live and die, they leave their remains behind, and they often leave behind signature molecules. So that's part of the search for life on Mars, is looking for what we call biomarkers, organic compounds that you can attribute to a specific organism, algae, something else, other eukaryotic organisms, bacterial organisms. So we can do that through Earth history. We could pull out these organic molecules and see the history of life. The history of life is told not only in fossils, but in organic compounds through time and through genomics. So much of what we understand now is based on phylogenomics, looking at extant organisms and understanding in the living population is the history of what life was before. And so we can look at all of that, and genomics tells us that oxygen production wasn't introduced by some distant form, but that it evolved probably about, and it's based on the lineage that we see today, the ancestors, at about 3 billion years ago, maybe 3.2. There's some debate about that. What my research group does, because we can't see the organic molecules, the rocks are just too buggered. They're too cooked up. They're too old. The older the rocks get, the more temperature, pressure they've seen, the harder it is to get their secrets. And so the organic molecules aren't preserved that far back, but there are inorganic expressions of having oxygen within the surface ocean. And so we think, based on rocks from South Africa, based on molybdenum isotopes and iron and uranium isotopes from another group, we think that oxygen production began about 3 billion years ago. And it took hundreds of millions of years from that beginning of oxygen production for the atmosphere to start accumulating oxygen. And that's because the earliest Earth said, well, okay, there's a little bit, it's going to take a while. Were all these sinks for oxygen, hydrogen gas and methane. It was like, oh, take that oxygen, I'll react with that. And so it took a while for the sink terms to be, it's a tipping point where the production became greater than the sink. And that happened at about 2.3 billion years ago at something called the Great Oxidation Event. And it was, if we're correct, and not everyone believes this, there's a group at Caltech that thinks that cyanobacteria evolved right at the Great Oxidation Event. We don't accept that. There are too many things that point otherwise. So it was this balance of production that sinks over time till about 2.3 billion years ago. And then we never went back to the world as it was before. Oxygen rose and fell, but it never went back to the levels that were present during that first half of Earth history. And we know those were very low. It's amazing what you can do with chemical records. there's something, I'll just say the words so you'll go, oh, okay. Mass-independent sulfur fractionation that has to do with how sulfur from volcanoes is processed in the atmosphere. And it gives us a fractionation between isotopes that's independent of mass, which is really bizarre. And that stuff ends up in the absence of oxygen into the ocean, deposits in rocks, and we can go to rocks that are 3 billion years old and 2.5 billion years old and 2.3 billion years old, and then that goes away. It goes away, and oxygen, and that signal never comes back because oxygen is present. It rises and falls, it's really dynamic, but it never goes back to those levels. So I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you can know, but the origins of life is probably the hardest, I think, actually. Yep.
Well, thank you for a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you.
Your enthusiasm is wonderful. And but because the nearest exoplanets that have the gases that strongly suggest there's some probability of life.
Not yet. We don't have that yet.
Right.
We're looking. We have CO2. CO2 comes from volcanoes.
Right.
Right.
But then the fact that the nearest exoplanets are so many hundreds of light years away.
Not hundreds, just a few light years away.
Okay.
So I know where you're going with this question, like, are we looking at life on a planet that was happening 1 billion years ago? These are not that far away. They're a light year away.
But I think you said earlier that we would never be able to get there.
Yeah. So.
But I think just the fact that we are learning so much about the origin of life on our planet.
Exactly.
That's enough.
Well, yeah, fair enough. And there's no right or wrong to this. What I would say is that, getting back to these critical questions, the idea if we find a place, and we're so worried, the burden of proof that it is biological is an incredibly high bar, right? We actually have meetings to discuss how we will release to the media the significance, the meaning of our findings. Because the first thing you have to assume is that it's not life, right? You just assume it's not. And you explore every possibility of how methane could have accumulated in that way, or O2 could have accumulated without life. And there are lots of ways of doing that. The Earth produces methane now that doesn't require life. But to build it up to persistent detectable levels, maybe it does require life. O2 can form in abundance from the photochemical breakdown of CO2 for certain planets around certain stars. So those false positives are just so essential, right? And so what I would say ultimately is that, and I remember asking a group here a long time ago, probably 6 years ago, I said, if we had a headline where we passed everything through all these tests, and we said scientists find evidence for life on an exoplanet, and it's probably bacteria, would that disappoint you that it wasn't, Flintstone reruns coming, streaming from us from a distant land? And everyone said, no, I wouldn't be disappointed. If there's any kind of life at all, that opens up so many possibilities. That's what it means for me. If it's one place, then it's probably a lot of places. And you can roll this film in different ways and get to different places. But it means, given that every star, when you look up, you're not going to see them tonight, but when you look up and see the stars, imagine every one has planets around it. And so if there is life somewhere, then we have an N of 2, and then maybe we have an N of a lot. And that, I think, is really important. I don't worry about intelligent life. There are people there's not enough on Earth, I would say. And so I would say, well, I'm thinking of politicians specifically, none of us. Sorry if I insulted a mayor or a city council person, but but the point is that there are people who do that, the SETI Institute, right? I have a student who came in, and he's a new PhD student, and he's come from SETI land, and he's really keen to use radio telescopes and try and find signals, and that's totally cool, right? But actually, most of the NASA investment for exoplanets is on atmospheric signals of microbial processes, because our atmosphere is shaped, well, today by humans, right? So that's a technosignature, because that rapid CO2 increase is a great biosignature, right? It's really great, because there's no natural way of doing what we've done to the atmosphere. Despite what people might tell you, you can increase CO2 at the rate that we are through geological processes. It's from burning fossil fuels. The seasonality that is natural on top of the Keeling curve is a biosignature, right? So, the technosignature side is something that we play around with, but it's not my centerpiece. I think the world is controlled, carbon is cycled, the atmosphere, climate is controlled by what bacteria do, what microorganisms do in archaea. And so most of the focus is on gases that derive from those microbial processes. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So much of what you've talked about is about focus. You said, I think, that there were 9,000 plus exoplanets in our galaxy. The Webb telescope is discovering many, many more galaxies.
Why is the focus on our own galaxy?
No, not so much that. I know why to focus on our own galaxy.
Because we can see it.
Is what they're learning possibly going to change whatever's learned about life? Are they identifying other things that impact?
These are sort of philosophical questions, right? You could easily come here and say, BS, I don't give a damn whether there are microbes on another planet. I'm not saying you're saying that, but plenty of people would say that. But that's not the history of science. It's not really the history of NASA investments, right? It's about great exploration and answering the big questions. Putting humans on the moon initially, we developed technology in the process, but it was getting to the moon that made us so proud. And now we're going back to the moon. And so my personal feeling is that it's a wise investment for NASA. There's lots of complementary benefits from that, right? Again, the technology. I don't think so much about Mars exploration because we want to live there somewhere someday. That actually, to me, is a concern. If you're thinking that we don't have to worry about what we're doing to our planet because you can move to Mars, I know you're not saying that, but we should be focusing on our own planet, right? And so it's not, for me, it's not about where we can go. It's just the same reason that someone got on a ship for the first time and sailed across the Atlantic to see what was further to the west than they knew. It's wondering what's out there. And then I think once we understand what's possible in our galaxy and our universe, it forces us to think a little bit more about what we are and where we came from and what it means to be us. That sounds deep and heavy, I'm sorry, but I think that's kind of what it means to me. And there are lots of practical applications, but it's really driven by this idea for me of like, are we alone and how did it start? Which is, from that early slide, something that's captivated human imagination forever. Right, and so those people 2,000 years ago weren't imagining moving to another place. They just looked around them and said, where did this come from?
We're going to just take two more questions. We
Yeah.
have one there and then one here, and maybe you'll stay for a few minutes
Sure,
if
of
people
course,
have
yeah,
other
Yep.
other
I
things
kind
they
of
want
have
to.
a silly question.
No,
What do
there are
you
no
think-
silly questions.
What do you think of the UFO sightings? Truthfully.
I have no information that you don't have. I don't watch.
The probability.
I mean, I just don't have any data for that. I watch the same shows on the History Channel that you do. No, I actually don't watch them, to be honest. I don't think there's any credible evidence for a UFO. I think it's the same idea. It's the parsimony, right? It's the idea that take the simple explanation before you invoke something that's harder to explain. And it's the same with the origins of life. Before you build too complicated of a house of cards, start with the simple and add pieces as you have to. And I don't think, to my knowledge, there's no observation that requires something extraordinary. There are plenty of things. I mean, I've driven by I had an experience in Arizona where I looked at something and said, what the hell is that? And it was a contrail of some rocket that had been launched. We read about it in the paper next day. So I think that, so many of these things, all of these things, to my knowledge, can be explained. And when I listen to people talk about this that actually do this for a living, I've not heard anybody say that there's credible evidence for something else. Yeah, but it's a great question. Not really answerable fully. I don't think our government is hiding great secrets, though.
Okay, one last question. It is.
Are we alone?
I've been dying to ask this all night. Do you believe in extraterrestrials?
Well, so the first thing I would tell you, and I got this on one of my first papers that I submitted, that we don't use the word belief, because belief is faith-based, right? So I wrote in a paper and I said, I believe that this reaction, they said, I think, I don't believe, right? So belief is something that, doesn't require empirical evidence, right? And so in an empirical sense, I can't tell you, right? I mean, it's a massive universe and a massive galaxy. I can't tell you that there isn't life. What I can tell you, as I said over here, is that I don't think there's any evidence now that suggests that we've been visited. There's just nothing that points to that. It doesn't preclude it, but
Unless you have something to tell us.
yeah. No, I'm not, I can't speak to that. Remember, I'm the one who's looking for methane around an exoplanet. Yeah, well, I would love to find methane around an exoplanet. I think that's probably a smarter NASA investment, although the intelligent life, the technosignature is really interesting. I mean, it's really, these things are not that hard. Like I can sit down with my sons and say, what have we done to our atmosphere? The rapid rise of CO2, the chlorofluorocarbons that have destroyed our ozone. And happy story, I talk in my class about things that we've done well. The Montreal Protocol, where we said, you know, we can put hairspray on without pumping out CFCs. And we can collect the coolant from our car and our refrigerator without releasing it to the atmosphere. The ozone hole is due to be repaired, I think, in about 40 years, right? And so the CFCs don't have a natural source. So if you saw them on an exoplanet, that's, I was going to say, an intelligent life signal, but maybe they should have been smarter they probably were smarter about using them than we did. But there are things, and some people, really credible science, focus on technosignatures, as they're called. Yeah.
So I know we have some climate stewards, UCR Palm Desert Center climate stewards in the room. And I'm just, a show of hands, how many people believe that this planet is pretty darn special and we should take good care of her?
Well, not me. Is that a rhetorical question?
And yeah, exactly. I think that's the big takeaway. Like, it's pretty darn amazing that we have Earth.
Every day I'm amazed, but what our planet has done.
Thank you so much, Tim. This was fantastic.